My name is Elena Beverly, and I'm the Director of Urban Affairs for the Office of Federal Relations and the Office of Civic Engagement at the University of Chicago. I have the honor of being your MC for the afternoon. I'm going to start off with our audience polling question for our lunchtime discussion, which is about the role of the media in shifting the narrative about race and urban America. So if you would please take out your devices, take out your phone. You can text 22333 and then Urban FWD to get into our polling. You can also see from your screens that you can engage online. And our question, which I can't read from here, but I think I have memorized, is something to the effect of, has the media helped, harmed, or highlighted issues of race in urban America? I'm seeing some of the responses. While people continue to vote, I'm going to go ahead and introduce your moderator for this next discussion. A.J. Jones is the Chief Policy and Communications Officer for the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. AJ, in his role, he leads the execution of the Foundation's policy, communications, and advocacy strategies worldwide. Specifically, he executes strategies where those are influenced and driven by key U.S. and international officials. AJ serves as a key spokesperson on behalf of the Kellogg Foundation and works in coordination with the Chief Strategy Officer and the leadership team on the Foundation's portfolio grantee investments and operations. He is responsible for establishing and managing public-private partnerships and serves as the primary policy interface with multilateral institutions, global and domestic investment agencies, and public and private philanthropies and government. AJ?
Well, excellent. Thank you all so much. No mic here. I want to actually start with basically saying thank you for having this conversation. What better way to have lunch than to talk about race in the media? But for all intents and purposes, I am so appreciative that we have some exceptional people here today to engage us in this conversation. But one I want to start with is always context. After all, we are in Washington, D.C., and nothing can be appreciated without the absence of context. And so as I was thinking today, what contextually is a way of thinking about how we've interacted with the issue around race in the media, I came to this unique quote that was written by W.B. Du Bois back in his book called The Souls of Black Folk, first page, first line, first chapter, where it says, "Between me and the other world, there is always an unasked question. How does it feel to be a problem?" And he goes on to say that being a problem is a very strange experience when one does not know what it's like not being a problem. Treating people as a problem people versus people with some problems. And oftentimes, the way that we identify humanity is through the dynamic of media, in terms of how we empathize and connect with the people and the stories and the way in which they tell their narrative from a day-to-day reality. So with that being said, the smart people now will come and help us lead to that conversation. So first of all, I want to welcome my good friend, and mind you, we're going to be joking a lot because we're all family and friends here, so you're going to have to maybe pause us and stop us from time to time. But first, I welcome my good friend, Jonathan. Let's give him a round of applause, please. So every adjective I give is an adjective that sticks. So Jonathan, you can call Mr. Amazing.
Thank you.
And then next, let me welcome up Joanne. Please, let's welcome her. And what I have to offer to her is one of exquisiteness, right? And let us welcome up Maria, too, as well, please.
I feel like they greet her.
And what I offer here is exceptional. So with that being said, let us start this conversation with a really interesting but easy question. which is
AJ, you are too smooth.
Yeah, right?
Too smooth.
which in many respects, right, is how we engage the media when it comes to the question around race. And what I often want to have people think about was the first story you remembered, whether it was reported in the news, whether it was reported in TV or in print ad, but the first story that was impactful in the way in which it described an issue that had a racial overtone. So let me start with Jonathan and work my way from
Why
there.
on earth would you? That is a great question, and there have been so many stories with a racial dynamic that I don't even know where to begin. We could go back to maybe OJ, which before I left the office, that's back in the news. But as you were asking the question, I think that the story that popped into my head was Trayvon Martin.
Yes.
Because if you go back, it's been 4 years now, like 4 years in a week since he was killed by George Zimmerman, that it was then that the national conversation, this latest iteration of the national conversation on race, started happening. And you can trace back to that killing when not just black people were angry and upset and horrified, but that the horror was more widespread. More people got it. More people understood what was happening. And then when you look at the last 2 years in particular, when people could actually see with their own eyes what black people have been complaining about, have been protesting about, had been urging action on for generations, the conversation broadened even more. So I'm going to leave my answer at that because that's a very wide, open-ended question.
Absolutely.
Well,
Go ahead, please.
so for me, probably the first one that really kind of struck me was when I was a kid was the Atlanta child murders. Because it was the first time that I had that notion of of black children being vulnerable to be killed just by being black children. And it was really like something that in my house we were captivated by, and because I was a kid, it was really scary to think about kids dying. And I think my kids, Trayvon Martin was sort of their Atlanta child murders, in which they were, teenagers, and seeing a teenager, in the case of my middle son, exactly his age, dead, and then, and not dead in, a car accident or an airline accident, but at the hands of just another guy, not even a police officer. So I think they had it. And then the other, what I would say was formative for me, even before OJ, was the Rodney King case. Because the Rodney King case was one in which you had this combination of, black bodies just being brutalized and riot, which is something that when I first moved back to New York, when I was in my late teens, we were experiencing Yusef Hawkins, and we were experiencing, later on Amadou Diallo. We were experiencing this constant menace based on race. So it was sort of almost a theme of my teens and youth and teens, this constant reassertion of the menace that society, that white people could visit on you just because you're black and because you're young. So I think that for our kids, when for me it was those cases, and for my kids it was definitely Trayvon.
Powerful. Maria.
I think for me it was in high school. I was doing some research on investment, and I happened to go into a full-page ad where it said Reebok is not investing in South Africa, and I found that really powerful. But then I, at the same time, was simultaneously angry because it was in Essence magazine, and it was the first time that I realized, and I think I was a freshman, that I realized that we are basically siloed in the messaging and conversations in our media from the very beginning. To suspect that Reebok wouldn't think that would be something that I would find in any other magazine, to me was powerful. To think that, and that was a contribution. Shortly after that, it was, I'm from California. The Rodney King thing was was really reflective, not surprising, because I grew up in Sonoma, California, where racial profiling is part of the history of the community. I always say Sonoma is a beautiful, beautiful area. I say my family helps make it beautiful with every single job. I have a very large family, and I do not know of a young man in my family that has not been stopped by a cop and racially profiled. And so the story of Rodney King was something that was personal, and that happens every single day in the community that I grew up in. The difference was that he was caught on tape. And so it resonated, and I think that it was, again, the beginning of this social media movement of visibility, that just because it wasn't filmed doesn't mean that did not happen.
As you think about those stories, I'm touched by what was the most shocking element of it. Was it the fact that it pierced the conscience of things that had been raised in those communities before but never were actually connected to or appreciated or quite frankly thought to be true? Or was it more so for the first time there was an elevating of an issue, but there was a sense of a lack of grappling with what language to use to talk about it? As I think about, for instance, the Trayvon Martin issue, I remember distinctly how you had different broadcasters trying to figure out how to write about race without writing about race. And as I think about specifically the Rodney King beatings and in the aftermath there within, it was how to tell a story about a personal narrative and a community narrative and a national narrative without at the same time acknowledging those narratives are in conflict with each other. And I just was kind of curious, do you think, and I'll start back with you, Maria, do you think that part of the reason why the Reebok piece, as an example, was put there was because they didn't know how to talk about it in a way or label it in a way that could connect to a national discourse in terms of seeing themselves?
I think that they didn't think that the rest of the world would care, right? I thought that they figured, well, I need to sell Reebok to the African-American community, and they're the only ones that are going to care. Media has a role to be inclusive and to I actually think that we are in an incredible opportune time where we have a level of consciousness among people of color and among whites where we know what happens when we don't have conversations. And it took us, over a century to get to this place where there is a consciousness of what happens, and that we actually have allies that are actually willing to take on the hard conversations and actually move our country forward to capitalize on this opportunity. And instead of building off of that and having frank conversations and hard conversations and uncomfortable conversations, but recognizing that they can come from a good place, we are turning them off, or we're siloing them, or we're giving voice to the most radical voices, but not creating that space where like-minded individuals can come together and actually be a platform to say that is not okay.
Yes.
But I would say at the same time, one of the things that's sort of distressing when you go back and go all the way back through all of these cases, from Rodney King all the way forward to Michael Brown and on Freddie Gray, is what's been consistent. And that includes the ones even earlier than that. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Yusef Hawkins case, the case where back in the late 80s, black kids would be chased and beaten if they went into the wrong neighborhoods in New York. If you're of a certain part of Brooklyn, Howard Beach, different parts that were predominantly white. And it happened to my cousins who lived in Canarsie in Brooklyn. If they went over a certain invisible line, they would get chased with baseball bats back over. And sometimes the black kids would retaliate by, chasing them back. But it was very tense in New York, but, you were not supposed to be out of your neighborhood. In the case of Yusef Hawkins, he was in the wrong neighborhood and was eventually chased across a highway and killed. And we had these things keep happening over and over again, whether it was that or whether it was a police officer killing a black person, or whether it was the little Guyanese kid who was run over by the Hasidic motorcade, and they drove away, and their ambulance only helped the guy who was driving and left the boy, and the community had to lift the car off of the child who was 9 years old, and then the community tried to stop the motorcade in place, and a riot broke out. But in all of these cases, all of them, including Trayvon, including Michael Brown, the victim very quickly became the villain. And it was consistent that when the victim was black, there was always in the media an excuse made for their death. that blamed them, that turned them into a bad person, that unearthed their sins. You know, sometimes it was as extreme as Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York, releasing the juvenile arrest record of Patrick Dorisman after an undercover cop shot and killed him because he shoved the cop because the cop insisted he was a drug dealer when he was not. He was just a security guard. And Giuliani never visited the family but released his juvenile sealed records to show he was no choir boy when in fact
and
he actually
was a choir boy.
a choir boy.
But I think that's where a lot of there's so many of these stories every single day, and I think that it's a matter of how do we actually break it open and actually hold the media accountable to tell the stories. And they're the hard stories. I mean, how many people here have ever heard of Andy Lopez? I'm going to venture you're Latina, but I don't know. So Andy Lopez was a 13-year-old boy from where I went to high school, who was killed in 2013 by a cop because they basically saw that he had a toy gun and they basically thought that it was an AK-47. So the middle school in Santa Rosa, the middle school kids organized and they started marching out. These were middle school kids. They marched to City Hall. They were greeted by City Hall being completely shut down and a SWAT team of people on the roof pointing rifles at them. It never made it national news. Their hashtag was Brown Lives Matter. Since the tragic death in Ferguson, we've had 6 young Latino men killed through the same circumstances. And no one is talking about it because it is very easy and safe to have a conversation only around immigration when you're talking about brown. Right. But when you start actually talking about poor, black, brown, and white, because this is an epidemic that is increasingly also targeting poor white males, then you can have a conversation, how do we fix it? And how is this a collective issue? And how do we actually start holding the powers that be accountable? And how do we hold the media accountable to stop putting us in nice, clean boxes that make it easier?
And Jonathan, how would you see that?
Okay, so the thing to your original question about, in terms of writing about these things and connecting the stories, the great thing about the job that I have at the Post is something happens and an idea pops into my head and I want to write something, I can write it. And when I write, I don't write from a remove or at a distance. I throw myself, my background, who I am. And so when Trayvon Martin was killed, it was, and then all of the other killings that happened, it became very personal. Because even though I am who I am, I made sure that the people reading me understood that I understood that I am not safe. I don't feel safe. I know I'm not safe. And there, but for the grace of God, someone else could be writing my story. And so the thing that, I'm always that person who tries to find the pony in the pile of manure. And so in the Trayvon Martin situation, when I wrote the piece...
I love that.
You don't ever want a pony in the pile.
The positive thing I took away from it in terms of the conversation that Trayvon's killing struck up was that in the piece that I wrote about the talk that I was given as a teenager. And in talking with white colleagues, some with tears in their eyes, like Cynthia and Carmen, saying, I had no idea. I couldn't imagine having that conversation with my 16-year-old. Now, these are just 2 people, but there's 2 more people who understood because they knew me and they took the time to read me. And so just by being myself, I was able to bring all of those conversations and storylines into one piece. And then unfortunately, because this is America and we're dealing with race, I knew it would happen again. And so, when Tamir Rice was killed, and they tried to do to a 12-year-old boy what they did to Trayvon, what they did to Eric Garner. I think more people got it. They got it with Eric Garner. They got it with Tamir. They got it with LeVar Jones. They got it with, especially with Walter Scott. The conversation that's happened, the awareness that has happened, I think is incredible. And in terms of the media, I want us to broaden the conversation when we talk about media, because it's not just print and broadcast / cable. Because we're in the world that we're in with Twitter and social media, we're all part of the media. The reason why Trayvon Martin became a story was not because the Washington Post and the New York Times wrote about it. It was because Black people heard about the story and were upset for the family and demanded that the media pay attention. That's the main reason why the national media could no longer ignore the story. And so with people pulling out their cell phones and taking pictures and taking video, they've become part of the media and force us to pay attention. I mean, I was subbing for Steve Kornacki the weekend that Michael Brown was killed. And then when you're doing this, you're in the zone and you're paying attention. It was late at night and I'm about to go to bed and I just checked Twitter one more time and I see this hashtag Michael Brown. But what's this about? So I start going through and I'm reading the local stories, and I emailed the producers and say, hey, do you know about this Michael Brown thing? Do you think we should do something? And then I couldn't get to sleep until 1 o'clock because it was like, we have to do something about this. That was social media.
And I think Jonathan makes a really good point, which is that, and we all work in TV to varying degrees, right? I'm employed by cable news, and it strikes me that the order that Jonathan talked about is now the order. TV has always been a lagging indicator because we're visual. We require a visual. So the Rodney King case worked on the TV because it was a visual story. The Tamir Rice case can make it to TV because it's a visual story. Michael Brown, there's no proof of anything. There's only the visuals we're not allowed to show, right? We're not going to show the body because our standards department doesn't want us to. People start to have perceptions about what's too inflammatory to show. So can you show Tamir Rice kicking snow and acting like a little kid before he gets killed? Is that going to be seen as biased against the police? Like all of these things come in TV that don't come in print. You can actually, in a print story, flesh out and really tell a story. Whereas in the visual medium, we're stuck with the visuals and what our sort of lawyers think is appropriate for us to say.
But I think more recently, though, the crisis in Flint is also a great example, though, of race and disenfranchisement that the media is starting to cover. But that was first broken, for the large part, in Twitter.
On Twitter,
yes. And but it's interesting again. So we started doing all these national conversations, and again, the absence of a community was completely missed. And in this case, the Latino community, there's about 1,200 people that were denied water because they did not have an ID. They did not hear about the crisis that was happening in Flint, except they started getting calls from family in Mexico who are watching it on TV because they don't have language specific. So as we talk about race, again, we have to be able to open up our arbiter and say it's not just black and white anymore. It's actually a very different America. And how do we make sure that, again, we have this idea that the media wants to put us in boxes, and we have to figure out how, as communities, to say that is no longer an option because we actually are having a shared experience.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, in keeping with that, maybe this is where your point is going. In keeping with that, I'm reminded of that order also in terms of the complexity now, in terms of the dynamics that we have to discuss in reference to the broadening of not only of race and ethnicity and class and social equity and the like, but also the dynamics of how we now are all a part of the media. And what struck me was I remember distinctly at the time, Eric Holder said that we are a nation of cowards, right? And he was speaking that in terms of how frustrating it was for us to have this more broader conversation about race and justice and the like. And I'm kind of curious, as we have more tools, whether it be Twitter or Facebook or what have you, have we also shied away from being also as transparent, if you will, in our conversations because we're, say for instance, concerned about being named or being blamed about something or not having the right lexicon to talk about it? Or has it opened up new ways to talk about it that people didn't think about before? And I was just kind of curious on that.
I don't know. I mean, I think so I am very visible. Joanne is very visible. Jonathan is very visible when we are tweeting about something. So folks have a very clear understanding of where we stand on certain issues. My concern oftentimes with social media are the cowardly people who hide behind the egg and haven't decided that they hide behind the egg and all of a sudden they get emboldened. That's not okay. I'm free of having conversations, but then at least have the courtesy and the courage to show us who you are. And I think that that's how we can actually start moving forward. I think that right now we have presidential candidates that are leveraging the eggs in certain ways, and people are basically feeling emboldened because we have someone that is saying that it's okay to basically say these horrible things. He's going to pack up his bags and go home, but then we're still going to have a whole group of people that all of a sudden we can't put back into the bottle, right? And I think that we have to figure out how do we have these constructive conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that we're a nation of cowards and a nation of bullies at the same time, which is usually the flip side of the same coin. In that, you know, to Maria Teresa's point, is that you have now people feeling like they can have direct access to people who are in the public eye, whereas when we were growing up, you know, you may see somebody on TV, but you don't have access to them. You could write a letter to CBS News and maybe Roger Mudd would get it at some point, but you don't have access to him. You can't just talk to him. Now people feel like they can get right at you. And I think that on issues of race, it's brought out things that aren't new. They just were already there. You know, if you go and you look at the places where Donald Trump is popular, the Deep South, places like Alabama, you know, Alabama gave Barack Obama 11% of the white vote in 2008. Rhode Island gave Barack Obama 58% of the white vote. I think in New York it was like 52. Mississippi it was 14. I mean, Louisiana was 14, and it was like 12 in you know, the deep basin of the South. He got almost no votes out of that region, and the hostility to Barack Obama is so intense in the old Black Belt and the Mississippi Delta and Alabama and places like that, much more so than in places like North and South Carolina, which are becoming more diverse, not just more diverse in terms of Black, but in terms of Black and brown. And those are sort of the things that are changing it. And so I think when we had that deep hostility that political correctness has kept a lid on, and sort of social mores have kept a lid on, what's happened is the only place that used to filter out was the comment section. So you read the comment section, and that's
never
where
read the comment section.
I know, you should. But that's what was coming out. And now Twitter's the comment
section. That is a dangerous place to go, is a comment section.
But I do think that a place where media can talk about, because we keep having the conversations on race, but we're also not talking about the complexity of generations. And generations are very, you know, when we say, why is Hollywood not showing our stories? Why is Congress over there not promoting policies that we care about? Why is media not talking about our stories? When you look at the makeup of the individuals within the institution, you could actually argue it's because they actually do not interact with every day with Black and brown people. Right? I mean, the executives do not. So if you do not have interactions, then it's very hard for you to actually muster a way to actually tell those stories or actually feel like you should be inclined to. I think that we are right now, so Generation X is bigger than the baby boomers. Generation Z, for the very first time, are going to be eligible voters. They're bigger than the millennials. They're the most diverse. And but the individuals that are currently in power, if the average congressional member is 65, and just bear with me, 65 years old, their their grandchildren are in college. They are not sitting next to the most diverse group of Americans, where 51% of them are Black or brown. So you can't even go home for Thanksgiving and say, how was school today? Because you can't, and say, you know, how was Jose? You know, because you've never met Jose. And your kids have never met Jose. And your grandchildren have never met Jose. So how are you going to actually start talking about stories for that? And so I actually think that us in this panel, in this room, I consider this a bridge generation, where we actually have a foot in both worlds. And so how is it that we can actually have the capacity, but also the foresight among the folks that are pulling the strings of power, to recognize that we are living a moment where we can prepare ourselves for what is coming.
As you mentioned the generational piece, and I'll be curious, and maybe I'll start with Jonathan about this as well. There is another element to how race and ethnicity and issues of engagement are talked about. And it's not only a negative side, but the stories about hope and joy and love and appreciation for one another from diverse communities, and the space to do that. I mean, oftentimes, when you read, whether it's stories, whether it be in the media or in the news or on TV, when it talks about hope and joy for African Americans, it usually says, well, grandmama so-and-so, she was visited upon by a group of people who just loved her cooking. And it's this kind of this dimensional dynamic. It really doesn't talk about, for instance, the 18-year-old who had a wonderful breakout experience as being a scholar, or the 19-year-old who's in a loving relationship with his partner and he happens to be Latino. I mean, and how do we create space and place for those types of stories to be told to bring a sense of humanity? And I was just kind of curious your thoughts about that too as well.
But again, I go back to when you say bring out those stories, where are they going? I mean, the media are large now. Right. And now, as Joy was saying, television is a lagging indicator. Right. Newspapers or dinosaur media are lagging indicators because now they are the ones who are reporting on this viral video, yes. this story that went viral. Everyone's so mesmerized by this story that's happened. People are making their own news. People are they're bypassing us in print and broadcast and just going on YouTube, right. going on Twitter, going on Instagram and telling their own stories. Remember, the President of the United States leapfrogged the White House press corps to grant interviews to stars on YouTube, including one woman who was like green glitter, yes. eyeshadow, and lipstick. That never would have happened, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, a generation ago, when I was a big head nerd in New Jersey watching Tom Brokaw and Garrick Utley and all these other folks. You probably never heard of that name before. But all these big news stars, they were the ones who got interviews with the President of the United States. They were the ones the people in power went to get their stories out. Now, everyone in this room has the ability with their phone, with their web camera, to be able to tell their stories, and if they hit it just right, NBC, CBS, ABC, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times will start writing stories about, this breakout story from this person who told this incredible story.
But I think also it gets back to something that Maria Teresa brought up, which is it's partly what the stories you can tell are based on who you know and who you're acquainted with. I think about the Oscars So White situation, right? Where Hollywood has this thing where they can only relate to a story about Black and brown people when they are suffering, right? Like 12 Years a Slave. Oh yeah, the Blacks are slaves. I get that. I understand that. The Blacks are maids. Got that. Let's nominate that. But something where
use an accent when you don't have an accent in real life.
Right. I got that. But a story where either there's no suffering or it's not an historical narrative like 42, like I get it, that's a historical figure, or where they're not central. See, I have this theory that Beast of No Nation, which was to me the best film made last year, would have gotten an Oscar nomination had there been a random white reporter in it. Because then there would have been that person that Hollywood could have zeroed in and say, I relate to that guy. Because there's nobody else in the story for them to relate to. And I think that it happens in, we look at Oscars So White, but we sort of neglected the fact that it isn't just Black people that were left out in terms of the recognition, but it was Latinos and it was Asian Americans as well, who have even fewer roles than Black and Latinos. It goes in that sliding scale because the idea is if it's an Asian film, it has to be some sort of like a martial arts film. We get that. It's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. We get it. But it's like just to have a love story between an Asian actor and a Latina. That just would never happen.
Well, and what's wild about that is that, believe it or not, in the 1950s, you had more Latino representation in media in Hollywood than you have it today.
Wow.
I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And the people who are filling the theaters are African American and Latinos.
Right.
So it's not even like they're saying, well, we're making our movies for our audience. No, you're not. Yes. You're just so. And I think there is something also a different level that is that. And I want to use Total Recall as an example, right? So Total Recall was an incredibly diverse movie for the 1990s. They came and remade it, and they didn't have any diversity in their cast. But then it's realizing that it's because they're also not making Hollywood movies for American markets anymore.
Right.
So now they're actually saying, well, we actually want really easy stories to digestible stories that are happening that basically are exported because our biggest markets now are China and Europe. which is fine, but then you're also exporting our own racism because we're not actually portraying African Americans and Latinos in positions that we are going to need when it comes to future negotiations with these world markets.
So one thing I have to touch on, because it is political season, and as we end things up, I would be curious to know just your thoughts about how the election process has been covered in Latino vote, African American vote, or just votes in differentiality. And then also just to kind of comment on your piece in reference to the media and the movies. What I'm surprised by, I remember as a young kid watching Prince of Arabia, and there were, there were no, even though it was Egypt, there were no Egyptian Africans, no Africans. And yet today we still have movies about Egypt, and there's no Africans in them. So I'm just, but anyway, that's another conversation. But in many respects, I would just love to just get your comments on that as we wrap up.
You ever want to freak out your friends? Just let them know Upper Egypt is the Sudan.
Right.
Because it is.
Right. But please, I'll start with you.
With
Maria
the
Teresa.
political
With the
season?
political piece, yes.
So we keep hearing about Latino vote is going to be one of the most influential, and part of it is because the Latino vote is no longer in the states that we expect. They're not just in Texas. They're not just in Florida. They're no longer just in California. 4% of the electorate in Virginia is the Latino vote. It was the Latino vote and the Asian vote that basically put Obama over the top in the last election in Virginia. That 4% all of a sudden becomes really important when you're talking about margins. I would say that when it comes to the coverage of the Latino vote, I would say it's poor. And I would say it's poor is because we are not talking about the nuances within the Latino community. We are not talking about the opportunities of bringing in voices that are experiencing those things head on. I will share with you. I had someone was asking about what was happening in Nevada, and they were saying, "Are Latinos going to come out?" And the real story, and it's something that I mentioned on air, is the real story is not if Latinos are going to come out, but it's that you actually have right now, at the moment, Harry Reid basically went in and started knocking on doors and saying, hey, the union really has to come caucus. And the union members were kind of quiet. But it was because they didn't realize that there was actually a division happening between the membership, that was vastly young Latinos, and the leadership, which was not. That's a story. What is happening within the democratic apparatus that basically people need to talk about so that we can actually figure out what is happening in the conversation. But that was only possible because of the work that we're doing, and because we have an inroads within the community in ways that other journalists do not have, and that would not have been able to actually provide that type of analysis.
And not to wander into Voto Latinos territory, but I will say that one of the things that frustrates me about the way we cover politics is it's very facile when it comes to communities of color. So we talk about the fact that Marco Rubio, just by virtue of being Latino, will be able to, command this incredible
We've had this conversation.
I've complained on this too, that he will just instantly, people will see the O at the end of his name and it'll be like hypnotic effect, and Hispanic will be drawn.
The O is spinning.
It's just spinning, and they can't resist. Right? And then Ted Cruz, who we don't talk about as much being Latino, which is an interesting thing because he sort of deracinized himself a lot more.
Absolutely.
But that he too would have some sort of lock on the Hispanic vote. And we don't think about the subtleties. We don't think about the fact that I believe there have been 8 Hispanic United States senators, all but like 1 or 2 have been Cuban American. What is that about? Why is it that the largest group of Latinos, which is Mexican Americans, which are like 2/3 of Latinos, have not been able to break that barrier in terms of getting a United States senator, but Cuban Americans, who are 5%, have been able to? Would a Cuban American play where I grew up in Colorado, where there are no Cuban Americans? Literally, it was just Mexican Americans, some Colombian, a little bit, but really Mexican Americans were the driving aspect of Latino vote. We don't analyze it that way. And with African Americans too, as somebody who grew up in a Caribbean context, we never get talked about in immigration. Will the immigration reform debate impact us, impact Africans who are also heavily undocumented? There are a lot of people who are overstaying their visas from the Caribbean who are also a part of that debate. Haitian Americans don't get mentioned in the debate about immigration. So I think the way we talk about politics, even with the idea, can Ben Carson access the black vote? No, no, he can't. Stop asking that question with me on a panel. No, he can't. His policies are an anathema to African Americans.
Right.
So it's like,
Well, he might get some.
he'll
get some, but he's not gonna-
he'll get the Republican black people. There are black Republicans.
Right.
They exist. So it's like we need to, I think, have a lot more subtlety in our conversation about all of these racial
Right, and the one thing no one's talked about, and I heard someone say it on television, I can't remember who it was, but Ted Cruz made history.
Yes.
when he won Texas.
Yep.
The first Latino to ever win a major party primary.
In Iowa.
In Iowa. When the person said that, I was like, oh, damn. How did I miss that? So that's my
I think
piece on that.
Cruz may have missed it, but that's
He wanted you to miss it.
Well, that's true. But in terms of, so we just went through between South Carolina and then Super Tuesday, a lot of talk about the African-American vote and Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And I was frustrated by a lot of the coverage because, as you said, it's facile. People mystified by why African Americans weren't glomming on to Bernie Sanders. But then when they talk about the black vote and Hillary Clinton, it's all, oh, well, it's because they're loyal to Barack Obama and the long history African Americans have with the Clinton family. And that's true, but that means they're not paying, and so they're not paying attention to what they are actually saying to black voters. Now, both of them, Sanders and Clinton, have messages that resonate within communities of color. But Hillary Clinton has done a better job of talking to black people. Someone in The Atlantic wrote this great line: Sanders talks to race, Clinton talks to black people. And when you pay attention to what she has been saying, the speech she gave at the Schomburg, the fact that she left Iowa about 72 hours before the caucuses to go to Philadelphia, yes, for a fundraiser, but to also talk to 50 black ministers behind closed doors who, from the reports that came out, this was not a hand-holding kumbaya session. They really put her feet to the fire on a lot of things. She left New Hampshire about 72 hours before that primary to go to Flint. And people are wondering, why is she doing that? People saying she was pandering to get the black vote. They're not paying attention to what she's saying. And I'm very passionate about this because I read this book that just came out a month ago, Brown is the New White, by Steve Phillips. Voter data, census data, when you read his book, the campaigns of Sanders and Clinton come into clearer focus, and definitely Hillary Clinton's campaign comes into sharper focus. Because if you understand that there is, as Steve says, a new American majority of 28% progressive whites, 23% progressive people of color, and that you can't win the presidency without attracting a large African American vote, then it starts to make sense that Hillary Clinton goes to Philadelphia, goes to Flint, mentions Flint in her speech at the Schomburg and also in her rallies. She says something that African Americans have longed for someone white, especially a politician, to say. We as white Americans have a responsibility to listen to our African American fellow Americans who are black, listen to their stories, listen to their pain, listen to what the solutions that they think need to happen. Folks underestimated how powerful that was and how powerful that is. And she is not going to, I don't think, going to stop delivering that message simply because they both recognize where the country is and where it's going. And if the Democratic Party and if the Democratic nominee wants to win the White House, they have to recognize that the country is blacker and browner.
Yeah, and I think to that point, not only is it blacker and browner, but it's also open to a broader conversation that has to be had. So with that being said, let's give our
Asian. We have to give
and
our
Asian
American
as well,
Fastest
absolutely.
growing group.
fastest growing group.
of Americans.
With that being said, let's give this incredible panel a round of applause.